Hi everyone, Vicky McFifty here from AM Healing My Soul TV. Today I'm talking with Lynda Wharton from New Zealand, and Lynda is a traditional Chinese acupuncturist and naturopath. She's been at the forefront of holistic medicine in New Zealand for 30 years, and during this time has operated her own busy holistic women's health clinic where she practices traditional Chinese acupuncturist and naturopath. So during the 3 decades, Lynda has been a prolific writer, columnist, book author, researcher and speaker. In 2008, she was the recipient of the New Zealand Health Industry Distinguished Service Award in recognition of her contribution to natural health in New Zealand. And Lynda is also a proud mother and stepmother of 6 daughters and a grandmother and step-grandmother of 5 grandchildren. So welcome, Lynda.
Hey, thanks, Vicky.
You're a busy lady.
Yeah, I was going to say you make me sound very busy reading all that out.
Yes. Did you not realise? So Lynda, your journey to where you are, like what I know that this show is all about grief, and people dealing with grief and how they've got through the other side of grief and where it's led you. So what is your story? How can you relate with grief?
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, it's great to be here, Vicky. Thanks so much for inviting me onto your show.
My pleasure.
And what you're doing is a wonderful thing. So I'm really, really excited to be one of the first people in this new process.
Thank you.
So my story, well, that most of the things that you just read out then were all about the professional side of my life, which up until 10 years ago, I was a mum. I was a single mum for several years with 2 daughters. And life was really good, really happy. And besides the focus on my family with my girls, my other primary focus in life was definitely my clinic and, the love of my work and all of my clients. And then everything really changed. Life changed dramatically when my youngest daughter was 10 years old. She's just turned 21 now, so that was 11 years ago. And she, at that point, was the victim of an abuse crime, and I didn't actually know about it for about another 5 years after that.
Right.
And that actually is surprisingly common. When children are abused in some way, often there's secrecy and shame around it, and it's kind of the luck of the draw whether that comes out or not. The knowledge comes out. So I didn't find out about this for another 5 years, but in the meantime, there were lots of our life was just turned upside down because suddenly this beautiful young girl who'd just been a really happy, healthy, normal child developed a chronic pain condition that had her in and out of hospital for 6 months, abdominal pain condition. They couldn't find anything wrong with her, but in the end they did actually take her appendix out because that's where the pain was located. They took the appendix out, and gradually over the months she came right and the pain disappeared. So in retrospect, years down the track, when I then learned about what had happened to my daughter, I put all the pieces together and realized that chronic pain condition was, somatization. It was a psychosomatic kind of reaction to her trauma.
Wow.
Know that at the time. So basically that chronic pain condition improved, but very rapidly after that, I started seeing huge changes in her behavior. I started getting calls from the school about inappropriate behavior. She started wagging. Hugely long story, but cutting it right down, what became apparent over the years was that it was after the abuse that she began looking for any way to cope with that trauma. Given that she wasn't telling anybody about it, it was a dark secret.
Yeah, very bad.
Yeah, the ways she found, even as a 10 and 11-year-old, were things like smoking cigarettes, getting her hands on alcohol as she started to get a little bit older.
Yeah.
And over the years, that just progressed and progressed through her teenage years, where she turned to increasingly hard drugs, starting with, marijuana, and working up through a whole range of drugs that culminated in meth addiction.
Wow.
In Australia, I think you call it ice, don't you?
Yeah.
New Zealand, they talk about meth. So she had a meth addiction and was using meth for about 4 years. And through those years, you know, there were repeated 22 missing persons reports where she ran away and lived on the streets at different times, multiple suicide attempts and self-harm. So just everything crazy and traumatic and out of control that you can think of.
Yeah.
That was our journey for how many years? For 8 years. For 8 years that continued. Yeah.
So that would have been so traumatic for her, but what about yourself? Like, this is a total loss of what you thought her life was going to be like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, obviously a central part of that whole process for me was grief. And it manifested in so many different ways. And yeah, you're spot on saying that part of that grief was the loss of the expectation of what I had for my daughter, which would be that she just grew up in a loving, safe, nurturing family home and, you know, was just a happy young woman growing up in the world.
Yeah.
And it's not so much that I had expectations of her, like, you know, being someone, you know, being a doctor or just a happy, functioning, normal life. I would have been happy with that.
That's what you want for your kids, isn't it? You just want them to be happy and yeah. When did you actually find out about your daughter?
She came to her dad and myself and said, look, I've got this problem. I'm using drugs. I need help. But the good news is that she's been sober and recovered now for 8 months.
That's fantastic. I mean, she has to be ready. You know, you can force it as much as you like, but if they're not ready to do it, then they're not going to do it.
You bet. That was one of my biggest learnings. It's taken me many mistakes, much heartache to get to that point of
I can imagine.
Absolutely knowing that when you're dealing with anybody with addictions, no matter what age, whether they're your child or husband or mother or whoever, there's just nothing you can do about it until that person decides that this is what they want for themselves.
Yeah, because you're dealing not so much with them too, you're dealing with the drug, and that changes their whole chemical, the brain. It changes their brain and they're not who they really are.
Yeah. And that's another part of the grief picture, because there's a lot of grief in being in relationship with somebody. I mean, obviously I can only talk about when that relationship's a mother-daughter relationship, but there's a lot of grief when you love this child you've brought up, you know, you've kind of raised them with certain values of kindness and compassion and honesty and all of those sorts of things. And then suddenly when the drugs get them, they just become everything dark that you can imagine, you know. They'll lie, they'll steal, they'll cheat, they'll do anything for the drug. And that's a huge grief, seeing that.
Oh, well, tell me about your grief. Like, you would have gone through so many ranges of emotions. You know, I imagine as a parent, was there some guilt around the whole thing to start off with? Was there regret, or what sort of emotions did you go through?
Yeah. All of that and more. So for years, yes, there was guilt. There was guilt. To this day, I do not know even now the full story around the abuse that happened when she was 10. I don't know what happened. I don't know who it was. And I may never know that, or she may share that with me when she's 40 years old. I don't know. So there's still a lot of, if I let myself go there, that is a place that I can still find a lot of pain. I can still lose myself in quite a bit of pain around imaginings, you know, not knowing, and tied up in that is guilt.
Yeah.
How did this happen? Where was I? You know, like when you don't know what it is you're dealing with, you can imagine all sorts of things. So there's less pain there now, but for a long time that was a real source of grief in the whole process, because obviously that was the thing that started this whole process, and that led into the addiction over the years. So, was there something I could have done? Could I have done something differently? I don't have the answers to that, really. So,
Yeah. And it's really her journey. Like, I know it's yours as well, but it's something that she is going through herself, and for her own reasons. So that's what's really hard when you're a parent, because kids have their own separate journey, and you've got to bear witness to what their journey is, and just be there basically to pick up the pieces. Because a lot of criticism is thrown towards parents for what their kids do, but if you bring them up the right way and that still happens, really it's out of your control. You can't do anything about it, and you just have to be there to pick, to be there for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And you raised an interesting point there. This idea around that you're not necessarily responsible for the choices that your child makes. I mean, even children in perfect, textbook families with devoted parents, educated parents, whatever, can still fall victim to trauma, and that can still roll out in, addictions and self-harm. And so, yeah, I mean, there are kids going down that road who have been neglected or have been abused by parents, but they're also, sons of pastors and daughters of lawyers, and
Right.
addiction just is in every layer of our society.
Yeah, there's no avoiding as a parent. It doesn't, it is really the luck of the draw with that sort of thing. It's who your kids befriend as well, and you don't have control over what's going on. And then once they try the drug, they just lose themselves, which is really sad.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
so it's been quite a journey for you, Lynda. So how has that transformed you?
Wow, that's a big question. Okay, so I would say that for a lot of years, I lost myself, completely lost myself. My primary focus, my all-consuming obsession every day was monitoring, controlling, corralling, lecturing, you name it, anything I could think of to somehow get through to my daughter and to somehow protect her from her choices and her actions. So that's a classic thing that happens in families where there's addiction. Everybody else kind of tends to wrap themselves around the addict and become the fall guy for that person and buffer them from the consequences of their actions.
Yeah.
So it's taken me the longest journey, even as a health practitioner myself. It's been the biggest journey, letting go of that way of being and standing back and letting her make her own choices and actually live with the consequences of those choices.
Yeah.
So going back to your question, how has it changed me? For the longest time, I lost myself because I lost all my passion in life. I certainly didn't have any joy. I was deeply traumatized by it. I actually developed a lot of emotional and mental health problems as a result of that journey.
Yeah.
So the dark night of the soul was very drawn out for a lot of years. But where I am now, having done a huge amount of work, for myself and on myself over those years, where I am now is probably the best place I think I've ever been in my life, because I truly believe I've now got the skills and the strength and the resilience to not only cope with, but to even, dare I say it, thrive, to even have a life greater than coping with, irrespective of what's coming in the future. And that's a really great place to be, because I have no idea what's coming, and it might not even be with my daughter. Like, she may now be clean for the rest of her life, or she may not be. Yeah. And irrespective of that, I now feel, that I've kind of deepened and found a sense of resilience that has been kind of hard won over the years, and it just sets me up for, I think, dealing with whatever comes my way now.
Yeah, and that's the bright side of grief, isn't it? Really, that if you can learn something from the process that you've gone through, and then turn it into a positive direction, it's such a meaningful thing too, because when you can survive that, you can survive anything, really.
Yeah.
And I think, focusing on the positive is the way to go.
The gift that comes from deep grief, when you have survived that grief and when you've come to the other side of that grief, the gift that comes from that is it's a deepening and an opening and a softening in some way.
Yeah.
Like your heart just gets bigger. And having been in that pain for so long, in that darkness, you just really develop a heart of compassion for other people who are going through the same thing. And also have the sense of, like, there but for the grace of God go I, because at any time grief can just drop back into your life. You just never know.
And I think you get stronger each time. Once you can get through one lot of grief, it's like, okay, well, it's not easy when something else happens, but you do tend to bounce back a bit quicker the second time round. If you go through it the right way the first time, because often if you're in denial and you're in grief and you don't go through the grieving process and you make yourself really busy and you're in denial, then the next lot that comes will hit you harder, and then it sort of
it becomes like a unit of grief, doesn't it? It reopens all the unexpressed grief from first time round, and then you dollop to it as well.
That's right, and it's so important. I think that's where society has broken down, in that acceptance of people who are grieving. There needs to be an awareness that people are allowed to grieve, and it takes them a certain period of time, and there's no time frame. Everyone's different, and I think that people are told to get over it so much these days, and for someone in your footsteps, that's going through, a child who's going through this process, it's over a number of years. It can last for a long time, and to be able to deal with that and cope with that, you must have learned a whole lot of coping mechanisms yourself, that you could now impart that knowledge on other people who are going through exactly the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I did. It was a very organic process. I mean, I did, obviously, like, I'm a researcher and a speaker and a writer, so I did what I do. I spent a lot of time on Google and researching things and reading books and going to talks and kind of educating and equipping myself with not just grief, but understanding post-traumatic stress disorder, which I developed and my daughter developed, both of us, and that's complex and complicated, and that's not something you get through overnight. So I learned a lot through that process, and I guess what if I had to distill just one single gem of advice for people going through grief, I think it would be, okay, I can't put it down to one, having said one. Okay, it's going to be multi-pronged, sorry. The central bit is to let go of any shame around your brokenness. Grief breaks you.
It does.
And, we live in this world where there's so much pressure and expectation for us to be switched on with our happy smiley faces and achieving our goals, and and that's just, when you're in the midst of grief, that's impossible. If you can get out of bed on any given day, it's a victory, right? So let go of your shame, and one thing I can share with people is my professional hat. 30 years in clinic, I've seen nearly 60,000 clients in that time, women, and so I know what's behind the masks, because they come into my room in a safe, confidential space, and it all hangs out. The tears grief starts.
Yeah.
I can tell people that so many of the people you know in your life, your family circle, your close friends, your colleagues, there are people in your world right now who are grieving, and
Oh,
they're doing it privately. They're
yeah.
suppressing the outside brokenness.
The masks of society, isn't it? Because everyone's wearing them, and I think that if you can break it down and you can be honest and authentic with yourself and with others, it leads the way for them. And they think, oh, well, they've spoken about it. Like it can be a chain reaction if you're open and honest about how you actually are in life with your grief. It leads the way for others. That's half the reason why I'm doing this show.
Absolutely. And it's really vital because one of the things I see is that, you know, we talk about the depression epidemic in New Zealand, probably the same in Australia.
Same in Australia, yeah.
Epidemic. But I truly believe that one of the root causes of that depression epidemic is unexpressed, unacknowledged grief.
Yep.
And we're not equipped, we don't have a culture that supports us and encourages us and ritualizes the expression of grief.
That's so true.
Yeah, so we suppress it. You know, we think it's a weakness to still be grieving and crying a year after somebody's died, you know, or you've lost a child or whatever. You know, the truth is you can go on grieving and crying at different stages and in different ways for years after.
I don't think that you know, it's something that stays with you for forever, but it's just how you handle it. And there'll be always, I mean, not myself, I have good days and bad days. They're more good these days. But when I do have like anniversaries or something, little trigger, that will set me off. But if you've got those, if you have processes in place where you know that it's only temporary, it's not going to be with you forever.
Yeah. That
feeling at the time, then you will get through it, and it gets a bit easier as time goes on.
Absolutely. And I think because of this cultural constraint we've got around grief, that suppressed grief transmutes into depression.
Yeah.
And grief itself is not depression, even though your emotions are everywhere and you cry at the drop of that is not depression. Right. It's when you don't know what to do with that grief that it becomes depression.
Yeah, when you get stuck and then you don't feel like going outside, you don't feel like meeting up with friends, you don't feel like doing anything. You lose focus, don't you, on the future, and that happens a lot with young people. They don't understand, and once they lose sight of a happy future for themselves, then they will go into depression, and then it all starts with the anxiety and the antidepressants and things like that they need to take because they're feeling anxious and upset all the time, depressed.
It's almost like a predictable kind of rollout of events.
Yeah, it is.
That.
Yeah.
And the other part of dealing with the grief, you know, besides letting go of the shame, is what you just alluded to there, and that is find people, even if it's only one person or two people in your life that you trust and that you can be real with, and let them know your pain and accept connection from them, reach out to them. And if you can't reach out, you know, accept it when they come to you, rather than saying, oh, no, I'm fine, I'm doing really well, I'm fine. You know, spend some time with them and like get real and be vulnerable. And speaking your pain over and over again is such a great way of getting through it.
Yeah, it is. And it's sharing your burden with someone else. It is always going to lighten your own. And then if they open up too, because if you're leading that way for others to open up, and everyone says, oh, look, I've been grieving over the loss of my dog, or I've been grieving over the loss of, you know, my friendship with someone. And then we all think, oh, wow, we didn't really know that. And then you start, everyone starts feeling better because they're sharing and creating this caring community.
Yeah.
You know, and it makes such a difference in your life when you've got support of people around you that are going through that process. Absolutely. And understand what you're going through. You know, it's very complicated, but all really that needs to be done is people need to talk.
just be real. Let down the drawbridge. Express your vulnerability. Be real.
Yeah.
That is the fastest way through it by far.
Yeah.
And interesting what you said. I really found that was my experience when, in the early days, when I became aware that that addiction was what was going on in our family, and I made a decision really, really early on to be real about it and to talk to people about it. I talked to my church community, my friends, my family, and what that did was, even people I'd known for years, it gave them permission to not only empathise but to start telling me about their experience with addiction.
Yeah.
For years, I had no idea that they'd had a child with addiction problems, or somebody else had addiction, and so it's like a chain reaction. And the world is just a far nicer place to be in when we can all be just real with each other and empathetic and kind. And none of us are superwomen or supermen. Everybody is struggling with something.
Yeah, it doesn't matter who that person is. They've always got everyone has got a struggle of some sort, and that's what everyone needs to be aware of. That they're not. No one's better than anyone else. We're all in this together, and we all should be helping each other. That's, to me, the bottom. That's what we should be doing. I really appreciate you sharing your story with us all today, and I know that there will be people that will definitely benefit from hearing your story and what they're going through in their own life. And
well, I really hope so. That's what it's all about. And thanks so much for the opportunity to be here, Vicky.
Oh, thank you, Lynda. We'll speak to you again soon.
Okay, bye now.
Bye.